It's good news.
Mark cracks me up.
Phew, okay.
Is it seeing us?
All right, come on in, friends. We haven't quite started yet, so we'll just let folks.
Yeah.
Lauren, what room are you in?
You got it,
Is,
yeah.
I did. Is Tuesday okay? I think I've already got one for Monday.
Tuesday's fine.
All right, give us, hey, if you be patient with us for a second, we're still rolling in here. All right, so, I don't think there's anything I need to say. Oh, I need to get your PowerPoint notes. Okay, I have that. Right. Friends of the room, we'll get started because I know Wendy has a lot to say. So again, if you're on the outer rim, don't talk to each other because that actually messes up our, if you don't mind having sidebar conversations, that messes up the audio. If you want to, if there's time to ask a question, you want to ask a question, you sort of need to come closer to the table because this has, like, as far as I can tell, it's about a conference room table spacing for the sound. And I'm gonna share a PowerPoint, which means I'm not gonna be able to see all of you in the room real well. So if something comes up, there's a sound issue or you can't see something, say something, and then we'll stop and we can hear you. All right, I'm going to, I know what I need to do. Give me 1 second. Okay. Huh. That's interesting. So give me a second. Why? Okay. I'm gonna let Wendy, do you have some maybe introductory things? I'm gonna see if I can fix this.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we don't need the screen for a few minutes.
Okay.
So you're okay.
Okay.
So I can't tell you how good this feels to be back in a room with people. I mean, it's amazing. And those of you who are on the screen, hopefully you'll be able to join us in the weeks to come. Let's get started. St. Augustine. It's a town of about 15,000 people in the northeast corner of Florida, just south of Jacksonville. It was founded in 1565 by some Spanish explorer. I don't remember his name, but that makes it the oldest continually occupied city or town in the United States. So today's book is a travel log, but really not that kind of travel log. It's a travel log of the heart. And the topic is not St. Augustine, but Augustine, Aurelius, who later became St. Augustine of Hippo, and that would be in North Africa, modern day Algeria. We pronounce his name Augustine, not Augustine. I will slip in and out, so forgive me ahead of time. It's easy to do. The protagonist is St. Augustine, judging from the title of the book, but in fact, as the author repeatedly points out, the main character of his book is not the venerable Berber church father, but us, as narrated by the ancient bishop, who from 15 plus centuries in the past appears to have actually been reading our mail. Before we start, I want to open with prayer. And this is one of his prayers that I've modestly adopted for today. O Lord, my God, most merciful, most secret, most present, most constant, yet changing all things, never new and never old, always in action, yet always quiet, creating, upholding, and perfecting all. Who has anything but what you have given? Or what can any man say when he speaks about you? Yet have mercy on us, O Lord, that we may speak of you, and in so doing, praise your name. So I imagine there are those among you who probably know very little about this man. Like I said, he was a late 4th century, early 5th century church father, coming out of the evangelical background that I came out of in the latter half of the 20th century. I knew very little about him. My Baptist background definitely was not much into saints except for St. Peter and St. Paul. I don't remember when I first actually heard of him, but I suspect it may have been in the early 1990s when Rich Boyd was here. I remember we did a Sunday school class back then on Richard Foster's book titled Devotional Classics. And Augustine has a chapter in that book on the Christ as the Mediator, which I pulled out this week to review. The Hippo connection, that would be his North African hometown, picked up quite a bit when Bill Hawkins came, because Bill would very frequently reference him from the pulpit. And actually for a period of time, the church stationery down at the bottom, some of you may remember it, had a famous Augustinian quote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." This is the first line from his most famous book, The Confessions, which we'll talk about briefly also. But here are some other quotes of his that you probably are familiar with, at least some of them. "God loves each of us as if there were only one of us." That one is music to the ears of somebody who grew up in a family with a lot of siblings. "Pray as though everything depended on God. Work as though everything depended on you. That's the perfect cocktail recipe for faith and action." Here's Pat Rowlett's personal favorite. "He who sings prays twice." And this one is the mantra of libidinous teenage boys everywhere. "Give me chastity and continence, but just not yet." Here's the one you need to hear when you're looking for blood. "Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die." And this one, follow carefully because you'll recognize it from another source. "Faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward of this faith is to see what you believe." He phrases it a little different in another portion. "Seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand." And in both of those, I think he's channeling the first verse of the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 11. So maybe you do now, having heard those quotes, know a little bit more about him than you thought. Maybe he's seeped into your spiritual pores over the years as he has into mine. But my goal today is to make you want to know him even more. That, after all, is the purpose of Read This Book, the summer offerings that we do every summer, which we've been doing for almost 15 years now. Adult Ed recruits a reader, someone passionate about a book that he or she has encountered and that has impacted their life of faith. And they let that person be a literary ambassador, presenting their case as to why others should also consider this book. Wanting them to dial it up on Amazon, to put it on the stack beside their bed at night, and more importantly than that, to actually read it. Traditionally, we start out with the presenter telling why they selected the book. And so later, when you actually read this book, you can tell others you selected it because W.P. Moeller spoke so highly of it. Now, Rad Moeller, I like to flag passages in books that I like so that I can pull them up quickly later. And Rad Moeller caught a glimpse of my book last night. I don't know if you can see it, but it's got a very fashionable green fringe. Rad says it's a sign of mental illness and told me to take them out before I came to Sunday school this morning. But I decided I would let you see it as an indicator of how much I enjoyed this book. And the title of the book, which when Maren gets back in here, we'll let her pull up. It's On the Road with St. Augustine, A Real World Spirituality for Restless Hearts. And the author is James K.A. Smith. Now, that's the number one reason why I got interested in this book. I mean, look at this cover. See, I hope you can see it. She'll pull it up. It is a stunningly beautiful cover, and you couldn't help be attracted to it just from the cover itself. But aesthetics aside, the second reason that we usually pick our books to present here during the summer Sunday school is that we often have some familiarity with previous works by the author. So if you can get up the cover or not.
I can't. I'm
okay,
sorry.
all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about this author, James K.A. Smith. He grew up a Pentecostal. He got his PhD in philosophy in Villanova, which is an Augustinian university just outside of Philadelphia. And his particular area of expertise and interest was the existentialists of the early 20th century. And he's considered by academics as a scholar of postmodernism. Now, I'm betting I haven't snagged you with all that. It took way more than that for me to get into this author. But let me tell you a little bit about that. Let's just say that my two least favorite classes in college, and I think I've mentioned this before to some of you, and also my most difficult were a physics course that I took, which was really difficult, but I slogged through it because I perceived that it was a useful discipline and that it was somehow important to me in my life and career going forward. The second bane of my existence in college was the one philosophy course which I took. It didn't make sense to me. My brain was not wired in that way, and I could detect very little, if any, usefulness at all to it. So beyond knowing that James K.A. Smith is a philosopher writing philosophical books, there had to be something else to entice me. And I can hold this up. I don't know if you can see it or not. One of the things that enticed me, can if you hold it up,
Oh,
can
sure.
you see it?
Sure, we'll try, yeah, we'll try this.
These mundane details, one of the things that enticed me was, number one, his beatnik goatee, because it reminded me of the drama professor I worked for in college for 3 years. Professor Smith originally came from Canada, which is dear to my heart because my mother's Canadian, as is one of my best friends. And having moved on from his roots at that Catholic university, he's now a professor at Calvin University, the former Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is a school in one of our sister Reformed denominations, and a school that's long been dear to my heart because of its similarity to the university that I graduated from, which was also Midwestern evangelical and academically rigorous. But beyond that, he's one of the very few people that you will meet in your life who fell in love with his grade school classmate, later dated that classmate, and eventually married her. This is a woman to whom he's still happily married, despite the fact that one of the chapters in their book details their marital bed interactions. I keep a list of those people who fall in love with their grade school classmates and don't date anybody else but marry that person, and I was happy to add him to my list. But most importantly, the reason that I chose this book is because it was recommended by other authors that I love to read and that I respect, most notably Tim Keller and Father James Martin, both of whose books I've done for earlier Sunday school classes and for Read This Book. So several years ago, 2017, when it first came out, I was an early reader of his. His first book is entitled You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit. And amazingly, I went into the library today to look up something, and there was a copy of this book on the desk in the library. I don't think it's been checked in yet, so I'm not sure if it's actually in the catalog, but the church does have it if anybody's interested in it. I'd actually considered presenting that book back in 2018 or 2019, but I got distracted, I think, by one of the Keller or Father Martin books. So maybe I can do that next year if I don't find something else. One of the reasons I enjoy this author's writing is that there is a constant barrage of current cultural references and touch points. There is barely a page or two where he doesn't include references to popular songs or movies or TV shows or literature. And that little bit of sugar that he sprinkles on top of philosophy certainly makes it a whole lot easier to get down. So as soon as his second book came out, this one that we're talking about, I read it. All right, so now I'm going to show you a portrait of the guy that we're talking about. This image, St. Augustine, this image is actually taken from a fresco in the Lateran Palace in Rome, which was the original from the 4th century home of the popes. And this fresco was done in the 4th century, so less than 100 years after Augustine lived. And it's believed that the image, which you'll notice is clean shaven, there's no beatnik goatee on that guy, came from a signet ring that St. Augustine actually wore. So it's felt by art scholars to be an actually fairly representative representation of St. Augustine. Before I lay out the book and share with you one or two of my favorite stories, I want you to get to know this saint better. But first, I want to remind you about something that we've been missing out on in this post-hurricane, soon to be post-COVID time, something that hopefully will return soon, possibly no later than September if we're lucky. And that would be the church suppers, where we meet in the fellowship hall and often start out with an icebreaker. Now, you might remember this one, this icebreaker. We're given a bingo card, and the goal is to go around and find people who match the descriptors on the card. You go around and you have conversations with someone that you may not know, trying to get to know them. And as you can, you then check off these descriptors on the card so that eventually you fill a vertical column or a horizontal row or a diagonal or even the whole card, and then you're the winner. So I'm going to show you, and it's a bad copy. It's not good, but maybe we can send out an email
We can, yeah.
of it later. Half of the bingo card for St. Augustine. And I was going to have you check some of these things off as I talked about them, but Maureen's not going to hold her arm up the whole time. So you'll have to do that later. And anyways, you're probably muted, so you can't yell out bingo on Zoom anyways. But I do want to, before we get into Augustine, I want to give you a little bit about Smith's modus operandi as a writer. He kind of moves back and forth between contemporary culture and the way in which that culture has permeated our brains and has programmed us to think as 21st century Americans. And then he ties that in the way in which we chase after our real, authentic selves. He ties this milieu into Augustine's writings. He talks about the pressure to be authentic, the pressure to be vulnerable, to be all that we can be, to maximize our individuality. And he places all of these concepts and these pressures up against the 4th century writings of St. Augustine. So a couple words now about a couple words that you'll hear and read a lot today, and if you read this book. One of those words is authentic, and the other word is vulnerable. And how often do we in our lives hear echoes of those two words? Authentic is like companies which have to be authentic in order to successfully market their wares. Dove Soap, for example, can't just show you pictures of beautiful 18-year-old size 2 models with perfect skin. They have to show you middle-aged, wrinkled and rolled, slightly overweight ladies in order to be authentic enough that customers will buy their products. Vulnerable, as in, well, maybe some of you share my dirty little secret and occasionally turn into The Bachelor on ABC, where you can literally amass a fortune if every time somebody says the word vulnerable, you put a dime in a jar. We all feel that contemporary impulse to be vulnerable, to be real, to share something that we might otherwise keep close to the vest. I haven't asked her yet. One day I will, but I think we even got a glimpse of that from our minister last week in her excellent sermon on why Jesus went away, which she preached in anticipation of Ascension Sunday. Maureen, as she was leading into her report on her family's experience with the foster care system, said, and I quote, "I'm going to risk telling a personal story." And to me, that was a manifestation of vulnerability. We heard it 3 or 4 years ago, also on Mother's Day. Maybe that holiday evokes demonstrations of vulnerability, when Brent Schlottman in the big room told a story about the sudden death of Aileen's sibling and spouse, and how he and Aileen had to fly to Alaska and bring home and later adopt the 3 nieces and nephews, and what effect that had on their family. And I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen Brent as vulnerable as he, or heard about Brent being as vulnerable as he was that day. I was not there to hear that story, but I got reports from a lot of you about it. So as I've mentioned, Smith places these culturally determined impulses towards authenticity, vulnerability, and individualism up against the writings of Augustine. And then he talks about Augustine's life experiences as Augustine himself relays them in his book, The Confessions of Saint Augustine, which is this little volume. And he places those alongside our contemporary experiences of things such as ambition, friendship, intimacy, familial relationships with mothers, with fathers, death, etc. And those are some of the chapters that he has. Much of the biographical information that you get in the book about Augustine comes straight from that book, Confessions. That book is considered by the literati to be the first modern autobiography. I actually think of it more as a memoir, not an autobiography. To me, an autobiography is kind of a detailed, usually chronological, personal history. It's a record of one's achievements, usually objective, as objective as you can get when you're writing about yourself, with more emphasis on facts than on emotions. The Confessions by St. Augustine, to me, is closer to a memoir. There's autobiographical detail, to be sure, but it's very subjective reporting of memories related to specific events with a focus on feelings and the processing of those memories. Now, Smith has this argument that the Confessions is neither an autobiography nor a memoir. He calls it something called a heterobiography, but I'm saving discussion of that for 3 weeks from now, when the books that I've chosen are actually a trifecta, a memoir trifecta. And so we'll put that on hold for now. I would say that if you choose to read the book I'm talking about today, the one by Smith, and you're interested also in Confessions, I would read Smith's first, because I think you will understand Confessions and appreciate it more if you read Smith's book first and then go to the actual St. Augustine book. Now, I have to give you a little bit of a warning about this book. As much as I enjoyed it, and I told you how much I've already enjoyed it, manifested by the green stickies, it's not an easy read. It's not a beach read. It's definitely not easy breezy. It's a slow read, and it's really a book to be read more than once, or even chapters to be read more than once. It's profound in many ways, but it is entertaining, and it's very relatable because of all the cultural references that Smith throws in, both pop culture and classical references. He tells tales of Route 66, of Santa Monica, California, of the TV show Portlandia, of the movie The Royal Tenenbaums. He discusses at length the Beat Generation author Jack Kerouac. He discusses songs by Bruce Springsteen, by Jay-Z, and a whole bunch of others. One more word of warning, and I alluded to this last week when Maren did her book. The first 2 chapters of the book are really a bit of a hurdle for somebody who's not well-versed in philosophy. They make a lot more sense if you read them the second time after you've finished the rest of the book. Once you can see where he's going with his first few chapters, they become a whole lot easier to understand, having seen how he plots it all out. Now, I hope I'm not scaring you off. I probably am. But basically, he tells you the story of how he, Smith, got hooked on philosophy while he was at university in Canada, especially the 20th century existentialists. And then he went to Villanova, which is an Augustinian Catholic school just outside of Philadelphia. He was going to get his PhD in the works of Martin Heidegger, who was the original existentialist. He was the first person to write and talk in that very specific way that existentialists look at the world and the way in which they talk about it. This all was happening right after World War I. But while he was there, very early in his doctoral course, he fell in love with a professor whose area of academic interest was St. Augustine. And in a few months, he realized how all those dead white men from the early part of the 20th century that left us the legacy of existentialism, people like Camus and Sartre and Heidegger and others, those who distilled and kind of focused and oriented modern culture around the ideas of the self and of being, were actually, all these guys were channeling this 4th century African bishop from the Mediterranean coast of North Africa, a church father. So there's a story in the early chapters of the book that Smith tells that kind of helps you put all this together. He calls those early chapters orientation. And I think this story, more than anything, helps orient you as to where he's going with his work. He tells of a book by an English intellectual named Sarah Blakewell that came out in 2016. And the title of the book is The Existentialist Cafe. And what she does is she paints a picture of a French cafe in the 1920s on a Parisian street cafe, with all these existentialist philosophers sitting at tables up at the front of the cafe. And they are eating, and they are talking, and they are smoking, and they are drinking, and they are arguing, and they're bouncing theories off one another, back and forth into the night like ping pongs, throwing ideas back and forth, rapid fire. And while all this is going up at the street front of the cafe, there is a guy quietly sitting in the back, just watching it all and taking it all in. And he basically, as morning approaches, and he's been watching this for several hours through the night, gets tired, excuses himself, goes to the owner of the cafe and pays the bill for all the existentialists sitting up front who are still going at it. And what that does is it kind of sets the stage for the premise of the book, that 1,500 years before these modern day philosophers came up with their ideas about being and self and individualization, there was a thoughtful guy writing in North Africa that basically anticipated much of what they said, and that nobody had paid any attention to for the better part of a millennium and a half. He had already wrestled with all the things that they were wrestling with. He had already written about them extensively, and more importantly, he wrote about them from a Christian perspective. He was their benefactor, he was their patron, he was the guy who made their conversation possible. And Smith's point, as I like to think of it, is that we would do well to let this guy buy us a meal sometime, let him be our patron, and let us be his beneficiaries. So I want to show you now how he lays out his chapters, and briefly then talk about my favorite chapter. But before I do that, I need to mention how timely this book is. It was published in late 2019. I read it probably November or December of 2019, shortly after it came out. And as I mentioned, I was tempted to present it last summer for Read This Book. I ended up doing Will Willimon's book, Accidental Preacher, instead. I'm not really sure why I didn't do this book. I think I just had this sense that I had to mull it over a little bit longer before I could talk about it with y'all. But remarkably, this book, which is extremely different from Will Willimon's Accidental Preacher book that I presented last summer, shares a bunch of the same themes. And most notably, one of the themes is absent fathers, or the search for a father figure. So I'm actually glad that I waited until this summer to present it. It's so much more timely, and especially since having gone through COVID, that whole experience really adds another layer to its usefulness. I couldn't believe how differently I read it, having been through the year that we've been through than when I first read it in 2019. So Marin's got up there the chapter outline. And as I mentioned, the first part's called orientation, where he lays the groundwork. And that was the part that I warned you about that can be a little tough to get through. It's worth getting through, but you just have to take your time. It's a little bit disorienting at first, but the basic themes that are in those first 3 chapters, and these are themes also of Willimon, his entire life, these have been Willimon's themes, are that as Christians, we live as exiles, we're aliens. Willimon calls us resident aliens. We're sojourners, we're pilgrims on a progression, like Pilgrim's Progress. And he talks about the metaphor of life being the road. And that's why Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road and Bruce Springsteen's song, his theme song, I can't remember the name of it, are so prominent in the book. He talks about other uses of the road, the metaphor of the road, like Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus leaves home and goes on all these journeys and these adventures and then comes back home. He talks about the Greek myth of Sisyphus. He talks about the George Clooney movie Up in the Air. You may have seen that. And the one that he doesn't talk about, but certainly that came to my mind, is Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy leaves Kansas, goes to Oz, tries desperately to get home, and finally is able to get back. But his point is that those other roads that other people talk about in other venues, it's different for Christians. We don't take off from a home to journey somewhere else and eventually return like Odysseus does or like Dorothy and Oz does. We're on a road that to a place, to a home that we've never been to before. And that urge and that draw is basically defines what the Christian life is all about and what a call is about and what conversion is about. And it's a place that's been prepared for us, that there's built into us this desire to get there, but we don't really know what it is or where it is. We struggle with how to figure out how to get there. And basically, this is a book that kind of addresses that. So now look at the chapters. Each of those chapters talks about a way stop or a rest stop or a halfway house or a detour that people need or use or stumble into while they're on this road. And not everybody will end up at all those places. I particularly identified with about 4 of them, and I'll tell you which 4 they were as we go down. But I can guarantee you that each chapter that you read, if it doesn't speak to you and where you've been and what you've been up to, you will know people that it addresses. You will recognize friends and other family in those chapters. And I read those chapters and recognized patients, you know, that I had taken care of for years. So the first chapter is how to escape. And each of those has the title. It's got the little subtitle, and there's actually a subtitle that I'm going to read you for each of those as I briefly tell you what they are. This chapter, the subtitle is What Do I Want When I Want to Be Liberated? This chapter is about addiction, and it is probably one of the best summaries of all the things that we can become addicted to and how that process works that I've ever read. It is fabulous. The second chapter was one that spoke to me, Ambition, How to Aspire. And the subtitle is What Do I Want When I Want to Be Noticed? The third is Sex, How to Connect. And the subtitle is What Do I Want When I Crave Intimacy? And this is the pillow talk chapter that I referenced when I was speaking about his wife earlier on. The next chapter, which I really liked, is called Mothers, How to Be Dependent. What do I want when I want to leave? And it basically discusses the dependence-independence paradigm. The friendship chapter was my favorite, I think, or maybe my second favorite, How to Belong. And The subtitle on that is What Do I Want When I Want to Belong? The next one is Enlightenment, How to Believe. And the subtitle on that is What Do I Want When I Want to Be Rational? There's a title called Story, which I didn't reread until last night. And it is an excellent chapter, particularly in this time we find ourselves in our country. How to be a character. What do I want when I want an identity? It talks about solidarity. It talks about evangelization. It talks about the influence of books in our lives, and specifically the influence of the Bible on Augustine's life. And those are 4 different things that you can't really think about how they would all mesh together, but Smith does an amazing job of meshing those all in that chapter. There's a chapter, Justice, How to Protest. What do I want when I want to change the world? Augustine speaks, and Smith, channeling Augustine, speaks to issues of penal reform. He speaks to slavery, which of course was rampant during Augustine's time. He speaks to capital punishment. He speaks to sanctuary for economic migrants, and he speaks of the worthy calling of politics. And that chapter really made me look back on all the stuff we've talked about the last several weeks in Lloyd's cast. The chapter on fathers, how to be broken. What do I want when I want to be embraced? It's kind of an extended riff on the prodigal son, which is one of my favorite stories from the Bible. So I really love that one. And then there's this chapter on death, how to hope. What do I want when I want to live? They're all good, but like I said, there were 3 or 4 of them that really spoke to me. I could see the value in all of them. So I just want to read you a couple quotes now from the book. This is still in the orientation part. And I'm giving you glimpses of those 3 chapters because I've already told you how hard they are. I want you to receive that they're not that hard. Augustine frames this search as a quest, a pilgrimage to the country called joy, where we find peace and rest because we find ourselves in the God who welcomes us home. Like the exhausted refugee fatigued by vulnerability, what we crave is rest. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. This insight is the opening paragraph of the Confessions, and it's echoed also at the end of his book 13. Lord God, grant us peace, for you have given us all things, the peace of quietness, the peace of Sabbath. The soul's hunger for peace is a longing for the kind of rest from anxiety and frantic pursuits. It is to rest in God. And for Augustine, to find this rest, to entrust ourselves to the one who holds us, is to find joy. In your gift, we find our rest. What we long for is an escape, not from creaturehood, but from the fraught, harrowing experience of being human in a broken world. What we're hoping for is a place where a sovereign Lord can assure us, you're safe here. Talks about the refugee spirituality. The goal isn't returning home, but being welcomed home in a place you weren't born, arriving in a strange land and being told, you belong here. But that would mean the human condition is suffused with a tenuousness, tethered to a beyond that is our hope, but that doesn't magically alleviate the trials of the journey. And that sense to me really reminds me of one of my favorite phrases of all time, how tough it is to live in the already not yet. I mean, I really think that that's what he's channeling there. He finishes up his introductory chapters with this little bit, and then we're going to talk about friendship. My goal in the rest of this book is to introduce you to Augustine as an ancient ethnographer, one who studies cultures, of our present, of us, someone who has stranger value, both because he is a citizen migrating to kingdom come, never quite at home in the world, and a stranger to our time, who nonetheless seems to have read our mail. But if the road has you beat down, if the sights have become predictable and tired, and there are nights that you look at your friends in the car and wonder, what in the hell are we doing? Please just let me out. I think that may be Bruce Springsteen there. If you're weary from the chase, broken by the journey, tired of the disappointment, unsettled by a sense that you like to find some rest, not in accomplishment, but in welcome, then Augustine might be the stranger you could travel with for a while. Not because he's going to blow sunshine and tell you feel-good stories, not because he's going to fast-track you to rest. Beware of any religious types who roll up in a DeLorean promising time travel to either a nostalgic past or a pristine future. Augustine is the perfect guy for the road because he's been on it and is sympathetic to all our angst on the way. There's almost nothing you're going to tell him that he hasn't already heard. You'd be surprised by what a patient listener he is. He was born on the road. He's seen right through the road is life philosophy. He knows who he is, whose he is, and where he's headed. And almost everything he writes is an effort to help fellow migrants on the way find an orientation that feels like peace. You might think of Augustine as offering a hitchhiker's guide to the cosmos for wandering hearts. Okay, so now before we finish up, I want to remind you, these chapters are like, they're like the rest stops or the detours or the way stops on the road, and not everybody is going to identify with any chapter. It's kind of like when Rad and I travel, he wants his rest stops to be Shell and BP gasoline stations, particularly this week. I want my rest stops to be Dunkin' Donuts and coffee and clean bathrooms. So different rest stops from those chapters up there are going to appeal to different people. But I promise you, if you read them, you'll identify with the stories that are told. My favorites were the one on ambition, the one on mothers. Augustine's mother, Monica, is my patron saint, and if you read the book, you'll understand why. And then most importantly, this chapter on friendship. Now, Augustine had this friend named Alypius, who was a childhood friend of his, who I believe went away to boarding school with him. He followed him back to their hometown. He followed him to Rome. He followed him from Rome to Milan, and he followed him in his conversion from this cult Manichaeism that they were both in to Christianity. They were baptized on the same day. And when it came time for Augustine to be a church father and to go back to Africa, Alypius went with him. Augustine became the bishop of Hippo, and Alypius became a church father in some other North African town. I can't remember the name. But they had the kind of friendship that where one could challenge the other, and it wasn't just letting the person go down a path when you could see danger ahead. And Smith deals with this in the book. It reminded Smith of the movie Good Will Hunting from a few years ago, when there was this almost homeless math genius wandering the streets of Boston, and somebody found out about him and offered him a scholarship full ride to Harvard, and he was about to not accept it. And his friend Chucky tries to talk him into taking up the opportunity. He's insistent that he not pass up this opportunity. And about that, Smith says, the true friend is the other who hopes you'll answer the call, who's willing to challenge you and upset you in order to get you to look at yourself and ask yourself, what am I doing? What do I love? Who am I? The true friend is the other who has the courage to impose a conviction, who paints a substantive picture of the good, who prods and prompts you to change course and chase it, and promises to join you on the way. He calls this a friend who leaps ahead, one who's glimpsed what you're called to be and is willing to let you be uncomfortable as you wrestle with the call, who loves you enough to let you struggle for your soul, but is standing by with a bandage and a map. And he then veers into this story about one of my all-time favorite movies. And I've told you guys in other venues about this movie, but I'm going to finish up with this and then read what Smith says about it. So one year, my younger daughter went to math and science following her brothers, and she came home for Christmas one year and gave Rad a Christmas present, which was a DVD. And he opens it, and it's this movie called Lars and the Real Girl. And I said, I'd never heard of it. I said, Chandler, where'd you see this movie? She said, well, they showed it to us at school every Friday or Saturday night at math and science. The kids would all get in some big gymnasium and they would show a movie and serve popcorn and sodas. I said, well, what's it about? And she says, well, it's about this guy in a sex doll. And I said, a what? And she says, this guy and the sex doll that he orders online. I said, Chandler, there is no way they would have shown you that movie at math and science. And she says, Mom, they showed it to us. It's a good movie. Well, I refuse to believe it. I refuse to let Rad watch it. I refuse to let the rest of our kids watch it. And finally, she went back to school after Christmas and she called me up 2 or 3 weeks later and she said, Mom, have you and Dad watched that movie? I said, no, I'm not going to watch that movie. She said, you need to watch that movie. So we watched the movie. It's a story that takes place in rural Minnesota, which is where I'm from. And it involves a man who's probably on the autism spectrum disorder. And he lives with his brother and their parent in the family home. The parents have died. Well, the brother's married and they get pregnant. And because they need an extra bedroom, this autism spectrum disorder brother has to move to a garage apartment out of their family home. And he's very lonely out there. And it's his search for friendship. And he orders this sex doll from this online place, and she comes. And her name is Bianca. And she moves in with him into his garage apartment. And it's a very chaste relationship. He tells everybody that she's a missionary from South America and she's home on furlough and she has nowhere to stay. And he's going to stay with her in his apartment until she has to go back to South America. And he explains this to all his Lutheran congregation when he brings her to church every Sunday. Okay. And eventually the girl gets sick and she's close to death. And here is where Smith picks up. One of my favorite pictures of this ho-hum, mundane, yet miraculous friendship that is the church is a quiet scene in the remarkable film Lars and the Real Girl. While the narrative is driven by drama surrounding a sex doll, don't miss the fact that it is probably the most powerful portrayal of church in recent cinema. I want to zoom in on just one scene later in the film where Lars, played by Ryan Gosling. I've told you guys about the scene at the funeral, but this is an earlier scene where Lars, played by Ryan Gosling, is sadly awaiting the death of his friend Bianca, the sex doll he has imagined is his missionary girlfriend. He awakes once more during this vigil and emerges bleary-eyed from the house, standing on the porch to consider the day. When he turns around, he finally notices that the porch is awash in flowers and candles and prayer cards for Bianca. Stepping back inside, he finally notices several older ladies knitting on the couch. We brought casseroles, one of them points out. The quiet clicking of their needles is the soundtrack of compassion. Lars sits quietly, moving his food around his plate. Is there something I should be doing right now? No, dear, you eat, one of them encourages him. We came to sit, another says. That's what people do when tragedy strikes, a third offers. They come over and they sit. Alypius is the model for the community of friendship the church is trying to be. A people who are called to come and sit with the world, to be present with it in its tragedy. You might not have imagined it, but sometimes the good life looks like casseroles in the quiet sadness of a mournful home. A table prepared in the wilderness by a people who are hoping for a feast to come. And that passage reminded me about a bunch of other authors that we have read and talked about over the last several years. It reminded me about Anne Lamott wandering in an alcohol and drug-fueled haze through the streets of a San Francisco Bay community until she wandered into a church and found a home. It reminded me of Lauren Winner, who in her book Still, which was written during the breakup of her marriage, writes about wandering through a small New England town when she's up there to give a talk to some church group and wanders into a church that she feels welcomed her, even though she's a stranger that nobody knows. It reminds me of Nadia Boltz-Weber and her funky community of faith in, I think, Denver, Colorado, that she writes about in Accidental Saints. All of those pictures of what the church is meant to be and what it can be. Now, I'm gonna hope that Maren can send out my bingo card and tuck it away with your order for the book. And as you read the book, you can check those off. Hopefully I've titillated you enough that you'll want to learn about some of those things on that card. They're all true. But I do want to recommend an excellent video that summarizes the book. It's a lecture that Smith gave, I think in February of 2020, just before the lockdown hit. He's at Regent University, the one in Vancouver, Canada, not the one in Virginia Beach. And he's giving a lecture on his book. And if you Google Augustine, Our Contemporary, How to Find Yourself, Regent College, and Smith's name, it's about a 45-minute lecture, which is an excellent summary of the book. And then there's about a 30-minute question and answer period. And it's interesting to see how he presents the book in pre-COVID time. I think some of the emphasis might have been a little bit different in the time that we're in now. So that's it. And just one last thing, patron saint of the Read This Book class. Augustine is the patron saint of the Read This Book class. He was in a garden, searching, heard some kids say, read this book, took it as a message from God, went in, found a copy of the Bible, opened it up, and found Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. Read those this afternoon. That's what converted this guy, and which started his path to be the super Christian that he became and the super influencer that he became. Okay, now, next week, to whet your appetite, Jim Copeland is going to be doing a book called The Telling, Judaism's essential book, reveals the meaning of life. And I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but it's written by a Yale Law School friend of his, Mark Gerson, and several of us were on a Zoom presentation of this book earlier in the spring. And I just want to tell you that I bought that book and I read it, and Jim will give you a glimpse of why this is true. But hardly a day has gone by since I read that book that I haven't thought about or referenced something that this Gerson guy wrote about. So don't miss next Sunday. I promise you it will be good. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. With that introduction, I'm intimidated about next week, not because of the book, but because of me, but great job.
Wendy, are these books put in our library, the church library?
Don't think this book is in the library. In the past, when I've presented a book, I've usually bought a copy and donated it to the library. So I will do that. Thank you, Jen, for reminding me.
Yeah, I'm trying to, hold on, I'm seeing if I can, I'm still learning this technology. So I put it on Wendy to lock it so that y'all would see her, and now I can't figure out how to undo it. So you're just gonna have to hear my voice. If you would like to be, I have a going email list for Read This Book. If you would like to be added to that, can you raise your hand on the screen or raise your hand in the room, and I'll write it down. So you get the bingo card, basically. Okay. Okay, so, okay. if I can do this quickly. Okay.
You share with me.
Okay,
The newsletter did not tell us which room you would be in.
I know, and that was my omission. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, we're in the Koinonia room, which we're gonna rename the Owl Room. So, okay. What was that?
Which room did you say?
So the large classroom. on
Above the cafe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good, okay. I think I got it. And Nick, okay. And I will get the rest of you. Okay, good.
Okay, thanks.
I think that's all. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.